This next chapter is going to be all about layers inside of Illustrator. And so in this particular movie, I'm going to first take you through a brief tour of the Layers panel. So much the same as in other applications like Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator does support layers of content, which means you have objects that can be stacked into individual groups using something called the Layers panel. So first things first, let's open up the Layers panel. It's over here on the right-hand side of my Essentials workspace. It looks like two sheets of paper on top of each other. When you hover over it, it will say Layers. Click on that to temporarily activate it, and then I'm going to click and drag it out into the window so that we can easily see everything that's going on. So by default, when you create a new document inside of Illustrator, it will create a brand new layer called Layer 1, and this is the layer that we're seeing here inside of my Layers panel. Inside of the Layers panel, you have several options at the bottom. You have this button, which will allow you to locate a specific object. You have the Make and Release Clipping Mask button. You have a Create New Sublayer button. And you have a Create New Layer button. So basically, you have two types of layers, regular layers and sublayers. Sublayers are just nested inside of regular layers, and I'll show you how to work with those in a future movie. Inside the Layers panel, also, you will notice that you have the ability to control the visibility, the lock, and also the toggle switch for each layer right over here on the left-hand side. So the visibility switch turns the layer on and off. As you can see, when I turn that off, everything disappears. Click it back on, everything comes back in. If I click the toggle for the lock, that means nothing out here can be done to this piece of artwork. So, for instance, you see how my pencil and a little circle with a line through it appears here. That means, hey, you can't do anything. And when I try to make a selection or do something, right now I'm feverishly clicking my mouse. It's not doing anything because that layer is locked. So if you want an easy way to prevent certain pieces of artwork from being edited or destroyed or manipulated in any way, just put them on their own layer and lock that layer. To toggle this layer open to see all of the sublayers, all you have to do is click on this little triangle here. When you click on that, it's going to expand it down and show you all of the different sublayers here in the sublayers panel. And so, as you can see, this one has several different pieces that make up this bulldog logo. I can close that by clicking on the triangle again, and I can unlock it by removing the lock symbol. You'll notice over here there is a little circle which enables you to select or target specific layers or objects and then move them around to different layers if you choose. I have a movie covering this specifically later on in this chapter. Finally, the last thing you need to know about the Layers panel is the Layers panel drop-down menu that's located here in the top right-hand corner. When you see this, click on it and you can open it up and see all of the options. Let me move this so you can see it just a little bit better. I'll move it over here and open it up. There we go. So we have several different options here to create new layers, create new sublayers, duplicate the current layer, delete a selection that you might have. You can go in and view the layer options, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. You can make clipping masks directly from here, enter isolation mode. You can also exit isolation mode, locate an object, merge selected artwork, flatten the artwork, collect into a new layer. That means if you had several objects selected, you could collect them and move them to a new layer. You could release things to layers. You can also create a template. You could hide all layers, outline all layers, or lock all layers. This is a very powerful drop-down menu where many of the key functions of working with layers are found. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with its location and everything it does. Now, again, this is going to come with time and learning more and more about layers, which we'll do throughout this chapter, but I just wanted to make you aware of it now. So that's the brief overview of the Layers panel. If you've got it out on screen like I do, you can dock it back by clicking and dragging it back, and I'll just place mine directly above the Artboards panel like I had it before, or you can simply reset the Essentials workspace if that's the workspace that you're currently using. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how we can start using layers to make our projects more efficient. Now that we've seen the Layers panel and we know kind of where everything is, let's use that panel to start creating some new layers inside of this document. So I'm going to go over here to my panels and I'll open up the Layers panel like so, and I'll drag it out into my window. And in the Layers panel, what I want to do is I want to create some layers inside of this. So the first thing I want to do is create two layers on top of it. So let's create one layer by clicking Create New Layer and another layer by clicking it again. So now I have Layer 1, Layer 2, and Layer 3. Now, depending on how many layers you've been creating or how many layers used to be in the file you're working with, it may or may not say 1, 2, and 3 in sequence like that. I've had documents open where I've created, let's say, 37 layers, and so the next one I create is 38, but then I delete some, and then the next one's 40. It just gets really out of whack sometimes. But you have the ability to rename these layers anytime you want. So if I were to double-click right here where it says Layer 1, when I double-click there, it gives me an inline text window that I can then plug a name for the layer in. So in this case, I'm going to name this Bone. Layer 2, double-click. This one I'm going to name this Text. And layer 3, we're going to double-click and name this Bulldog. Now that we have all of these new layers created, anytime we want to make a change to those layers, it's actually very easy. We can go right here and choose Options for, and it'll say Bulldog in quotes. That's the name of the layer you currently have selected. So if I open up the options panel for that, I have the ability to change the name, change the layer color, make that layer a template, lock it, dim the images on that layer to say 50%. I can also turn on and off the show, the preview, and whether or not it's printed. Anytime you make a change to anything in this dialog box, you want to go ahead and hit OK. But first off, let's talk about why we might want to change any of these options. So for instance, why might we want to change the green color? Well, the green color is going to be the color of the objects that you select on that layer. So basically, let's hit OK here. And let me make a selection down here on this blue layer so you can see exactly what happens. If I select something out of my artboard, notice how the outlines on this object are all blue? That's because the layer color is blue. If I were to go to the layer options for bone and change the color to something like yellow and hit OK, then the outline becomes yellow. You can see how this might be problematic if I were working with something that had a yellow color in it, or maybe the background of the object was yellow. So you want to pick colors for your layers that make sense and also that really create good amounts of contrast between those images and the background images around them. So in this case, yellow, not a good choice for the bone layer. So let's double click. Let's change this to something more, let's try something like the teal. That works. Hit OK. And now we have a decent color around there that creates enough contrast where we can see the outlines and it's not distracting and it doesn't really clash with any of the other pieces. Now, if we wanted to change the colors of any of these other ones, maybe they might be too close to this, like for instance, teal and this green might be a little too close. We can double click to the right and change the color again. So in this case, let's make this one something like violet and hit OK. So now we've got teal, red, and violet. Now let's go back and take one more look at that little panel and let's discuss some of these other options. So why might I want to turn on the template checkbox? That's because that's something that is going to allow me to use this layer as a template going forward. So when I do that, if I check that, you'll also notice that the dim images to 50% option is automatically checked. Basically, when you are bringing in raster graphics into Illustrator for tracing purposes, it's a really good idea to place those objects on their own layer. So let's say you sketch something out with a piece of paper and a pencil, and you scan that into your computer, you bring it into Illustrator, and you place it into a new document. Enabling the template function on that layer is going to automatically dim that so you can still see it, but you can easily trace over it to convert it into vector artwork. That's the main use that I have for this template layer. So usually I don't use this unless I'm actually trying to convert something from a pencil sketch into live vector art. You can turn it off by clicking the check mark, and this automatically disables as well. The lock mechanism is the same as we saw in the layers panel earlier. And the rest of these I usually just leave on unless we are not going to print a certain layer when this file goes to print. So for instance, if I had a layer specifically for instructions to someone, or we were making notes while we were collaborating, things like that, then maybe I don't want to print that layer. Again, these are totally going to be project specific and not anything that you would do every single time. Once you're finished making changes, of course, hit OK, and there you go. So hopefully now we have a better understanding of how to create layers and also how to edit them here inside of the layers panel. Now let's talk about how to start moving content from one layer to another. In the previous movie, we created 3 new layers inside of our Bulldog logo composition. And now in this movie, what we're going to do is actually start moving the pieces of the logo into their respective layers. So inside of the layers panel, I've gone ahead and done some heavy lifting for you. I've grouped the different objects together into sublayers. So I've got here a group that contains all of the text elements. You can see when I target it that it automatically selects thehappybulldog.com. I've also grouped the bulldog's head, which contains all of those elements that you see highlighted on screen. And then I've also grouped the bone elements, which are down here at the bottom. The only things that we really have to move to separate layers are the bulldog group and the text group. So what I'm going to do is select this group first, the text group. And then with that selected, you see that little blue icon out to the side there, little square. What I'm going to do is click and hold my mouse on that. And then as I start to drag my mouse up, you will notice that this little highlighted square appears, just like that. When you see that little highlighted square, that means you now have the ability to release your mouse and drop whatever it is that you have selected onto that particular layer. So if I wanted all of the text to be on this text layer, I now release my mouse and it's all on that layer. You can see now if I turn the visibility of this layer off, all of the text disappears. Let's do the same for the bulldog. Let's click on the targeting icon. That way we see that the entire bulldog head has been selected. You see the little blue square. Click and drag that up until you see a little square on the top. When you see the little square on the top, release your mouse, and the bulldog is now on top on the purple layer. So now we have bulldog, we have text, and then at the bottom, just by default, the bone layers are all in the correct spot. So the easiest way to sort of move things around when you have multiple paths and things like that is to go through and group them together. We'll talk a little bit more about grouping objects later on in the course, but for now I just wanted to give you a brief example of how you move things around using that targeting system in the layers panel. In the previous movie, I showed you how to take objects and put them onto different layers. And as we started to put those objects onto different layers, you may have noticed that each one of the layers now contains one of these little triangles over to the left. That little triangle indicates that you can open that layer up to see all of the sublayers inside of it. Now, sublayers are just basically containers for individual elements that live within a layer, and you have the ability to rearrange them and rename them much the same way you do regular layers. So let's take a look at how we can do that. For instance, let's twirl open the bone layer here by clicking. You'll notice that I have a group right here, and this is the bone at the very bottom. You notice when I select that, it actually puts a little selected icon next to the target, indicating that that's what's selected. But this is all grouped together, meaning there are several different objects that actually make up the bone itself. So let's twirl open the group, and we can see here that there are actually 2 objects that make up that, and then also a group that makes up the other portion. So we've got not just one layer, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of layers for just this element here. And you can continue nesting things into one another almost as many times as you want, really. But you want to try to keep things as simple as possible, and that's why I recommend using groups, because groups make it easier for me to target large areas of my designs and move them around in unison. Now, of course, not everything requires a group. There are certain elements that need to be left alone, and that's totally fine that you do so. For instance, where it says thehappybulldog.com, there are 2 types of text here, the big main red text in the middle and the words the and .com. I don't think all of those need to be together because the and .com are very similar, but Happy Bulldog is something all its own. So let's close up the bone layer and actually expand out the text layer. The text layer is grouped, meaning everything is all together. Thehappybulldog.com is all one group. If I twirl that open, you can see here are the 3 things that make up that group. So what I think we should do is actually rename these layers and then move them into the text layer independently so that they're no longer grouped. So here's what I'm going to do. Right here where it says the, I'm just going to double click where it says group, type out the. Where it says .com, I'll double click here and type out .com. And then here, double click and Happy Bulldog. I'm also going to change the stacking order because the Happy Bulldog text should be right in the middle of the and .com. So now it says thehappybulldog.com. Now, how do I move these out of this sublayer group and into the text layer? It's actually pretty simple. You just start selecting the objects and moving them into the top level of that layer. So let's target Happy Bulldog, drag the target up, drop it on the layer, and it comes out just like so. Same thing with .com. Let's move that up. And now the group disappears, and all of these are now individual sublayers. The only thing that really needs to be changed, again, is the stacking order. And so I can just rearrange those just by clicking and dragging them around like so. So now I've actually simplified that. We don't have quite as many levels of sublayers in here. We actually have good labels on our layers, and labels on your layers are really going to save you a lot of time and headache. So as you start to create elements in Illustrator, I highly recommend that you come over here and start naming your layers and your sublayers, as well as your groups or anything else that comes in over here, because it makes it so much easier to find it, select it, and then manipulate it after the fact. The final thing that we want to go through here, let's close up the text layer, is the Bulldog layer itself. Everything is grouped here. So let's open it up and see everything inside of here. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. So in this case, I don't think we need to go through and manipulate these individual objects. A little bit later on, when we start talking about isolation mode, we'll go through and I'll show you how to open up a grouped object like this and get control of the individual objects without actually having to drill down into the layers panel. Like I said, there are some things that are best left alone, and a group this complicated is probably one of those things. So in this case, I'll just double-click where it says Group, call this Bulldog Head, and hit Enter. Now I can collapse that layer, and my Layers panel is nice, neat, and clean, and completely labeled with exactly the right text. So that's how you work with the sublayers inside of Adobe Illustrator. Make use of them, make sure you're using them, and make sure you're naming them, because that is very, very important. We've already touched on several examples of locking, hiding, and rearranging your artwork here inside of Illustrator, but I wanted to take a moment to specifically talk about how to do that with your layers inside of Illustrator using the Layers panel. So let's open up the Layers panel here for just a moment and drag it out into the document window. And then we'll expand this out so you can see all of the different layers that are available to you inside of this particular file. So anytime you want to hide a layer inside of Illustrator, it's actually very easy. You find the layer that you want to hide and you click the visibility icon out to the left here. So for instance, let's say I wanted to temporarily disable the background layer. I could hide it by toggling that visibility, and the background layer will simply just look as though it disappears. Everything is still located on that background layer. You haven't deleted anything. You haven't moved or changed anything in any way. Basically, all you've done is you've temporarily hidden it from view. Everything remains. If you click it again, it comes right back. So why might you want to change the visibility of a layer? Well, if there's something behind that layer that you need to get access to, or maybe you just don't want to manipulate or change the current layer in any way, changing the visibility of that layer is actually a pretty good way to ensure that it remains the same no matter what you're doing at any time on screen. So for instance, when I'm working on something like a mobile application or a website mockup, there are things in the design that I don't want to change once I have them set. Things like the background elements, the status bar, maybe anything that references almost like browser Chrome or things like that. So all of that comes into play, and they're all objects that I want to remain static throughout the design. In addition to changing the visibility, you can also lock a layer. Locking the layer ensures that no changes can be made to it, but you can still see it at any given time. So for instance, let me grab my zoom tool here, and I'll zoom in on this top left area just by clicking and dragging across it. And as you can see here, I have several different things going on this particular screen. I've got some guides that tell me how big the actual screen size is, in this case 640 by 360. I've also got this status bar that represents part of the phone UI that I couldn't change even if I were writing an app. I've got this bottom part down here, which is based on an Android device for the back button, the home button, and the switcher button down there. And so all of that information I think needs to stay on screen at all times so that I know what it looks like and how it meshes with my design, but I don't want to accidentally click on it and change it and have to revert back and things like that. So it makes sense to me that I should be able to just temporarily lock those layers to make sure I can never make changes to them again. So let's see how to do that. I'll switch to my selection tool over here in the toolbar, and I'll just click on one of these items to see what layer it's on. And so in this case, when I click on this, you can see that the screens layer has been highlighted. And what I'll do is I'll zoom out just a little bit so that I can see what happens if I hide this layer. So if I change the visibility here, you'll notice that a lot of stuff disappears. If I turn it back on, you can see everything that comes back. See how big of a difference that is? That's not giving me a good representation of what the phone user interface is going to be. So changing the visibility of these layers really doesn't make sense. However, if I were to lock these layers, that means I cannot make any changes to them. So if I zoom in once again and pan over and try to click on this black bar to do anything to it, I can't. As you can see, I'm clicking and dragging and it's just bringing up a selection. It's not allowing me to change it, move it, or select it in any way. So that's why you might want to lock it. You can unlock a layer at any time simply by clicking the lock icon, and it will then be active and you will be able to manipulate it or change it in any way you need to. In addition to that, you can also remove layers. So many times I'll use layers while I'm designing something, especially layers that contain guides like the ones you see here. But later on, when I'm showing it to a client, all of this just sort of seems like extra information they really don't need to know or see. So I could hide those layers, or if I've saved out a copy, I could just get rid of those layers altogether. So in order to delete a layer, you select it in the Layers panel, come down to the bottom of the Layers panel, and click on the Delete Selection button. When you click on that, it's going to come up with a confirmation box. In that confirmation box, it's going to say, Guides contains artwork. Are you sure you want to delete this layer? That just means, hey, you're not deleting an empty layer here. You actually have stuff on it. If you're confident that it's okay to delete the layer, go ahead and click Yes. Once you click Yes, everything that was contained in that layer now disappears. If I zoom back out to fit this design to the screen, you can see there are no guides present on this design. If I undo that by pressing Command-Z on the Mac or Control-Z on the PC, you'll see that my guides actually come back up here in the top left-hand corner. I can redo the deletion of that guide layer by holding down the Shift key and pressing Command or Control-Z. That way, the guides disappear and that guides layer is also gone. At the end of every one of my designs, I will actually go through my Layers panel, make sure I don't have any empty layers or layers that aren't really needed anymore, and then I'll either delete those layers or I'll move the content from those layers to another layer, and then I'll delete the layer after the fact. But in most cases, it's a good idea to go through and clean up your Layers panel, whether it be through locking, hiding, or deleting layers, so that you can quickly and easily access the parts of your design that matter most. One of the things that people ask me a lot when they're talking to me about creating new Illustrator documents is, how do I do my layers? When do I know when to create layers? How do I know how many layers to have? Well, the answer to that is sort of difficult because really and truly, the number of layers that you have for any given document is going to be different based on the document and the project itself. What you need to start thinking about is how to segment your document in ways that make sense to you. So for instance, let's take a look at this document that we have on screen right now. This is a website mockup. And inside of this website mockup, you have to start sort of reading the different content areas that you have. So really and truly, I can segment this out into basically 3 different areas. We have a navigation area that goes all the way across the top, which encompasses this area right up here. We have a content area, which encompasses all of this stuff right here in the middle. And then we have a footer area, which holds all of this information at the bottom. So really and truly, I have 3 main areas to this website: a header, a content area, and a footer. Now, I'm not saying that every document you create is going to be that simplified, but that's the kind of thing that you need to start looking for. You need to look for things like a foreground and a background. You need to look for things like headers, footers, sidebars, that kind of stuff, and then start creating layer groups that make sense to you. So for this document here, I would probably need, I think, 4 different layers. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, Justin, you just said that there are 3 distinct content areas here. And that's right, I did. But I skipped one area that's not really a content area, it's more of just an aesthetic area, and that's the background. The background actually has several different elements in it. It has this piece up here, the little jagged line at the bottom color, and so all of that needs to rest on its own layer behind everything else. So you have to really start to look through your files to understand exactly where everything is supposed to go, and then make a logical decision based on that information and create as many layers as you need to. It's okay right off the bat if you don't create enough layers. You can go and add layers or delete layers at any time, like I've shown you throughout this course. Okay, let's go ahead and create these layers now. I'll create 3 more layers on top of that current layer. And so this first layer, layer 1, let's double click that and let's name this one just something very simple like BG for background. Layer 2, we'll name that one footer. Layer 3, We'll name that one, let's call this content. And then the top one here, let's call that one the header. So I've got a header, content, footer, and a background layer. Now, inside of the background layer is everything inside of this design. Now, we know how to make everything move, right? By targeting it over here. So let's just start moving that up. So let's select the navigation. We'll move that up to the header area. Let's select these different elements here. The We Make the World Better. Let's hold down the Shift key and select the logo in the middle. Let's select the slider controls, and let's select the text slider that grabs all of those. And if you want to move all of them in unison, you can click this little target here and drag them up to the content area, and they will drop right on there like so. And then the footer, that's going to be the footer icons and the footer text right there. So we'll take those and we'll drop them on the footer layer. And so now I have everything neatly organized. I can easily get to just about any section of my design just by opening up the layers panel to the header and getting a hold of my navigation elements. I could then close that up, go into my content layer, and so forth. So my tip for you is to start by analyzing the project that you're working on. What types of areas are going to be required in order for you to complete this project? Does it have a header? Does it have a footer? Does it have a sidebar? Does it have an area where you're going to make a form? Does it have something for, the audience to interact with? All of these different areas need to be in your head, and you could even sketch them out on a piece of paper if that helps you. And then start creating your layers based on the areas that you know are going to be in the file. You may not hit the nail on the head every time, but at least you'll have a better starting place and a much more organized file by doing it.